December 23rd, 1944. Night falls on the frozen Ardennes. In the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, hundreds of German soldiers find themselves surrounded, cut off, and forced to surrender to advancing American units. For men who had been told that capture by the Allies meant starvation, beatings, or worse, fear hung heavy in the frigid air. They marched with arms raised, boots crunching over snow crusted with blood, expecting humiliation, perhaps even execution. The first thing they noticed was the ratio. For every one of them, there were 5 Americans. Young men in olive drab with Monet helmets, Garand slung over their shoulders, machine guns resting casually at the ready. Behind them, the endless convoy, trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, stretching further than the eye could see. The prisoners had been told America was weak, decadent, disorganized. But as they stumbled past row after row of vehicles, their breath steaming in the cold, they realized the truth. The Americans had more of everything, more men, more weapons, more fuel, more food. One of the prisoners, Obergefreiter Karl Müller, could not stop staring at a crate being unloaded from the back of a truck. The wood slats cracked open, revealing boxes not of ammunition, not of rations, but chocolate. Real chocolate, rich and dark, wrapped in foil. The smell drifted through the night air, cutting through the stench of mud, sweat, and cordite. For a moment he thought it was a trick of the senses, some hallucination born of exhaustion. Then he saw an American private unwrap a bar, snap it cleanly in two, and press half into the hand of a captured German soldier. Karl blinked in disbelief. He had last tasted chocolate in 1942 in a Berlin shop before the rationing grew severe. In the years since, he had eaten turnips, moldy bread, and ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley. But here, in enemy hands, the Americans gave it away freely, casually, as if it meant nothing at all. Next came the cigarettes. One by one, American GIs lit Lucky Strikes and Camel Packs, the smoke curling lazily above their helmets. Then, astonishingly, they passed them to the Germans. To men who had been told they were monsters, who had been warned that capture meant torment, the gift of tobacco was surreal. Some German soldiers stared suspiciously, waiting for mockery. Others took the cigarettes in trembling hands, lit them, inhaled deeply, and nearly wept. The scene repeated itself as the prisoners were herded into trucks and taken west, away from the front lines. They rode in silence, eyes darting from the endless rows of American supply depots they passed. Warehouses the size of aircraft hangars stacked to the rafters with crates, mountains of food, cigarettes in boxes of thousands, chocolate bars by the ton. It was a civilization of abundance, rolling across Europe like a tide. Karl sat in the truck bed, the chocolate melting slowly on his tongue, the smoke of an American cigarette drifting from his lips. For the first time, the propaganda he had believed began to unravel. The Reich had promised him that Germany was the center of the world, that the enemy was starving, weak, inferior. But here, in the dark of a Belgian night, it was the Americans who were gods of plenty. He looked at his comrades. Their faces were slack with disbelief, as if they too were struggling to reconcile what they saw with what they had been told. One of them whispered, "If this is how they treat prisoners, what chance did we ever have?" The truck jolted forward, the convoy stretching toward camps none of them had ever imagined. In the distance, the horizon glowed faintly with fire, the front line still raging. But for these men, war was over. What awaited them was stranger than anything they had been told to expect. And as the convoy rolled through the night, Karl realized he was tasting the future, and it tasted like chocolate. The convoy rolled west for hours, headlights cutting tunnels through the night, engines growling against the cold. By dawn, the prisoners saw the barbed wire of their first camp rising on the horizon. They had expected misery. What they found felt like another world. The camp near Cherbourg was enormous acres of open ground, ringed by double fences, wooden watchtowers at every corner, and rows of long, low barracks that smelled faintly of fresh lumber. Karl Müller stumbled out of the truck with stiff legs, half expecting snarls, blows, or the jeers of victors. Instead, An American sergeant barked orders not in anger, but in rote efficiency. The prisoners were counted, divided into groups of 50, and marched through wide gates. The first shock was the scale. Karl's group numbered over 200, but they were only a fraction of the day's intake. In every direction, Germans were streaming in hundreds, then thousands, pouring into the camp. The war machine that had terrified Europe was now reduced to lines of weary men, shuffling past guards who treated them not with cruelty, but with almost casual indifference. Inside the wire, the reality sank deeper. The barracks were plain, yes, but dry. Each man was handed a blanket, not torn or ragged but clean, still smelling faintly of factory dye. Straw-filled mattresses lined the walls. For soldiers who had slept in mud and rubble, it was almost decadent. Then came the food. Karl stood in line at the mess tent, watching in disbelief as trays of steaming fare were dished out. Stew thick with beef and potatoes, bread soft and warm, butter melting into the crust, and impossibly coffee. Real coffee, bitter and rich, poured steaming into tin cups. He had not tasted it in years. Around him, fellow prisoners muttered in astonishment. Some refused at first, convinced it was a trick, but hunger overcame suspicion. Soon the mess tent echoed with the clatter of spoons and the low hum of men eating in silence, too stunned to speak. Karl raised the cup to his lips. The coffee scalded his tongue, and he almost laughed. He had forgotten the taste of something hot that wasn't thin soup or ersatz brew. It was not kindness, he told himself. The Americans had so much that they could afford to waste it on prisoners, but still every swallow felt like defiance against the lies he had been fed. Later, as they shuffled back to the barracks, the guards passed out cigarettes again. This time, the gesture was more than shocking. It was disarming. The guards joked with each other as they handed them out, treating it as routine. To the Americans, a cigarette was small, ordinary. To the Germans, it was currency. Back in the Reich, cigarettes had become more valuable than marks, traded for food, medicine, even safety. Here they were scattered like pebbles. One prisoner, a gaunt young man named Dieter, stared at the pack in his hand. His voice trembled. Do they not understand what they're giving us? Karl exhaled smoke, watching it curl toward the ceiling. They understand. They just don't care. Days turned into weeks, and the shocks kept coming. The camp was not paradise. There were rules, fences, boredom, and endless counting, but there was no starvation, no beatings. Work details took prisoners into fields or warehouses, but they were fed, clothed, and even paid in camp coupons. And those coupons could buy things that seemed impossible. Chocolate. The first time Karl walked into the camp canteen, he froze. Shelves lined with goods greeted him. Toothbrushes, shaving kits, stationery, and most impossibly Hershey bars stacked in neat rows. He picked one up, running his fingers over the crisp wrapper. Back home, his wife Anna had stood in bread lines for hours to buy gray loaves filled with sawdust. And here it sat in piles, for sale to prisoners. Karl bought one with trembling hands. He broke the bar in half and shared it with Dieter. The sweetness exploded across his tongue, almost painful in its richness. Dieter closed his eyes, tears slipping down his cheek. This is what they give their children, he whispered. Karl said nothing. The thought cut too deep. Not all prisoners accepted it so easily. Some insisted it was propaganda, a calculated move to soften them. They muttered that it was all a facade, that behind the smiles and rations lay contempt. But even they could not deny the abundance. For every cigarette lit, for every chocolate bar unwrapped, the Reich's illusions crumbled further. At night in the barracks, men whispered, not about victory, not about counteroffensives, but about butter, sugar, cigarettes, and coffee. About a country across the ocean that could send such luxuries even to its enemies. Karl listened, smoking in silence. He thought of Anna, of their cramped apartment in Berlin, the blacked-out windows, the empty cupboards. He thought of his daughter, her cheeks hollow, her hands always reaching for food that wasn't there. If this was how America treated its prisoners, what kind of life did its people live? By spring 1000, 945 more shipments arrived. Boxes of Red Cross packages filled the warehouses. Biscuits, cheese, meat, powdered milk, jam, and always more cigarettes. The guards passed them out casually, never thinking twice. But among the prisoners, a new economy bloomed. Men traded cigarettes for chocolate, for favors, for extra food. The smoke curled through the camp at night, softening the edges of despair. One evening, Carl sat on his bunk with a half-empty bar of chocolate beside him. He stared at it for a long time before breaking it carefully into smaller pieces. One by one, he handed them to the men around him. The barracks fell silent as they chewed. "Do you realize," Dieter murmured, "that this chocolate bar could feed a family for a week back home?" Carl nodded. He realized more than that. The war was lost, and he had known it for months. But it wasn't tanks or planes that convinced him it was this. A single bar of chocolate, more plentiful than bullets. He lay back, smoke curling from his cigarette, the taste of sugar lingering on his tongue. He felt a strange mixture of shame and relief. The Reich had promised victory through sacrifice. But here, in an enemy camp, he tasted something else entirely. Abundance. And in that abundance lay the true power that had broken them. The ocean crossing was the last ordeal. Crammed into the holds of troop ships, thousands of captured soldiers lay in hammocks stacked 5 high, rocked endlessly by the Atlantic swells. Seasickness claimed many, the stench of vomit and unwashed bodies mixing with diesel fumes. Guards patrolled with clipped efficiency, neither cruel nor kind, simply maintaining order. Carl Muller counted the days by meals, watery stews, hard biscuits, coffee ladled into tin mugs. At night, he listened to the creak of the ship, the distant groan of steel under strain, and wondered what awaited him across the ocean. He imagined America as a land of neon signs and wide streets, but also of suspicion and punishment. The Reich had warned that captivity abroad meant humiliation, forced labor, endless toil in the factories of the enemy. He braced for that fate. But when the ship finally docked in Newport News, Virginia, the scale of the reception stunned him. The prisoners marched off in long columns, guarded but not jeered at. Civilians watched from a distance, but there were no stones, no shouts of hatred. Instead, curious children craned their necks, pointing at the men in tattered Wehrmacht uniforms as though they were oddities from another world. Trains carried them inland, rumbling through landscapes Carl had never imagined. Rolling green fields, tidy farmhouses with white porches, and towns where shops overflowed with goods. Even from the train window, the difference was blinding. Stores glittered with advertisements for soap, flour, tobacco, radios. Nothing was scarce. Nothing was hidden. And people moved with the unhurried ease of those who had never known a ration line. When the train finally stopped, the camp before them dwarfed anything in France. Barbed wire fences stretched for miles, enclosing neat rows of wooden barracks and vast open fields. Guard towers stood at intervals, their sentries watchful but relaxed. Carl counted silently, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of men funneling through the gates. The Americans had built cities of captivity. Inside, the astonishment grew sharper. Each barrack had wooden bunks, proper mattresses, and potbelly stoves that burned through the winter. The mess hall was industrial in scale, serving hundreds at a time, but the food was plentiful. At his first meal, Carl was handed meatloaf, potatoes, green beans, bread, butter, and again, coffee. He stared at the tray in disbelief. Around him, men hesitated, waiting for some trick. None came. The guards moved through the hall, joking with one another, unconcerned whether the prisoners gorged themselves. "Eat up," one said in halting German, grinning. "Plenty more where that came from." "Du selber. And tell you was not that." The words cut Carl like a blade. Plenty more. Back in Berlin, Anna queued for hours for a loaf of dark bread, sometimes going home with nothing. His daughter begged for sugar that didn't exist. And here, his captors gave him more food than he could finish, with casual abundance. But the greatest shock came days later, when the canteen opened. The prisoners received camp coupons, small slips of paper redeemable for goods. Carl stepped into the storehouse expecting soap or razor blades. Instead, he froze. Shelves lined with goods towered around him. Tins of sardines, cans of peaches and syrup, biscuits, jam, coffee tins, shaving cream, writing paper, and then the familiar sight that nearly buckled his knees. Rows upon rows of Hershey chocolate bars. Next to them, cartons of Lucky Strikes stacked like bricks. He reached for one slowly, afraid it would vanish. The chocolate felt heavy in his palm, wrapped in crisp foil. He exchanged coupons, unwrapped it with trembling fingers, and broke off a piece. The sweetness filled his mouth, almost overwhelming. Around him, men gasped, laughed, or simply stood in silence, staring at the bounty. Cigarettes circulated as easily as air. Guards passed them out, with no thought, tossing packs to prisoners as though they were candy. To the Americans, they were nothing more than smoke. To the Germans, they were a parallel currency. Within weeks, an entire economy bloomed inside the camp. A cigarette could buy a favor, a chocolate bar could buy loyalty, and whole black markets sprang up around these luxuries. Carl watched it unfold with unease. The Reich had taught them to sneer at decadence, to prize steel and sacrifice. But here, in the enemy's grasp, power belonged to whoever had chocolate, whoever had tobacco. And yet, he could not resist. One night, sitting with Dieter and two others in the barracks, Carl unwrapped another bar. The rich smell filled the room. He broke it into equal pieces and passed them around. They chewed in silence, savoring. Dieter shook his head slowly. "Do you realize," he said, "my little brother has never even seen chocolate? He grew up on ersatz bread and potato soup." Carl exhaled smoke, the cherry of his cigarette glowing faintly. "My daughter, too," he murmured. "I don't know what I'll tell her. That while she starved, her father ate chocolate in an American camp?" The barrack fell quiet. The sweetness in their mouths turned bitter. But the shock never faded. Day by day, the camp revealed more. Prisoners were allowed to write letters home, supplied with envelopes and paper. Some were sent to work on local farms, where they saw abundance up-close fields bursting with crops, barns stocked with livestock, families who spoke kindly and fed them hearty meals before sending them back behind the wire. The contrast gnawed at them. The Reich had promised victory through suffering. America demonstrated something else entirely. Victory through excess. The cigarettes and chocolate were not just luxuries, they were symbols. Symbols that the enemy could afford to share what Germany could not even give its own children. Carl lay awake nights, staring at the ceiling of the barrack, smoke curling in the dark. He wondered how Anna would react if she knew. He wondered what she would think if she saw the shelves of the canteen, the piles of goods treated as ordinary. And most of all, he wondered if the Reich had ever stood a chance against a nation that could drown even its prisoners in abundance. The first months inside the American camps were not marked by brutality, but by contradiction. For men like Carl Mueller, every day carried a double edge, the relief of survival and the gnawing humiliation of comfort. They had been conditioned to expect cruelty. Rumors in France and Belgium painted Americans as savages, barely restrained from shooting prisoners outright. Propaganda back home declared that captured soldiers would be worked to death in mines, starved until their bones protruded. And yet when Carl rose each morning, he smelled coffee drifting from the mess hall, felt the solidity of bread in his hands, and tasted meat almost daily. The shock was not just in the abundance, but in the normalcy of it. Carl remembered his first work detail outside the camp. Loaded into a truck with a dozen others, they were driven through the countryside of Arkansas, where the land spread in waves of fertile green. The war seemed impossibly far away. Farmers greeted them not with spit or curses, but with cautious civility. Under the watch of guards, the POWs hoed rows, gathered hay, repaired fences. And at midday, the farmers' wives brought out meals that staggered the Germans: roast chicken, corn on the cob, pitchers of cold milk, slices of apple pie that glistened under the sun. One farmer's wife set down a tray and, without ceremony, lit cigarettes for the men before retreating into the house. Carl lit his smoke with trembling hands, inhaled, and for the first time in years, felt something close to dignity return. It was this that unnerved him most. Inside the barbed wire, life rearranged itself. Cigarettes became the currency of survival. One lucky strike could buy 2 chocolate squares. 5 cigarettes could convince someone to launder your shirt or trade you a pair of socks. A whole pack could secure loyalty or silence. Carl watched as the system evolved. Some men gambled, losing weeks' worth of coupons in a single night of cards. Others hoarded, turning their barracks into vaults. A former banker from Hamburg became a camp merchant, exchanging rations for smokes at rates that grew sharper by the week. What began as relief turned into hierarchy. Yet the Americans never seemed to notice. To them, it was background noise. Cigarettes flowed so freely through their hands that they scarcely valued them. Guards flicked away half-smoked butts, oblivious to the Germans who scrambled after them, snuffing out embers to roll into new sticks. Carl's bunkmate, Dieter, often cursed under his breath as he retrieved these scraps. "They don't even know what they waste," he muttered. Back home, a cigarette like this would be shared by 3 men, smoked down to the paper. Carl said nothing, but he understood. Each butt rescued from the dirt was not merely tobacco, it was proof. Proof that the Reich soldiers had been sent to fight against a nation with resources so vast it could afford to squander what others bled for. The letters home compounded the dissonance. Prisoners were encouraged to write, and Carl, with neat script, began his first note to Anna in December 1943. He wrote cautiously, aware that every word would be censored. But even within those boundaries, he struggled with what to say. How could he tell her that he ate chocolate every week, while she likely scoured bombed-out markets for potatoes? How could he admit that he smoked American cigarettes in warmth, while she shivered through blackout nights in their ruined apartment? Instead, he wrote, "I am alive. I am well. Do not worry for me." He signed his name, folded the paper, and felt the weight of lies heavier than any chain. Around him, conversations shifted. In the barracks at night, men no longer boasted of the Reich's victories. They compared flavors of Hershey versus Nestle, debated which brand of cigarette burned smoother. Some joked bitterly, "If this is defeat, perhaps we should surrender sooner next time." Laughter followed, brittle but real. Carl found the change disquieting. The war seemed to melt away inside the wire. Yet every so often, a reminder cut through the haze. One bitterly cold evening, news spread that a transport of new prisoners had arrived, men captured in North Africa. They stumbled into camp thin as skeletons, uniforms in tatters, eyes sunken. Unlike Carl's group, they had endured months of privation. When handed their first ration trays, they devoured food so quickly that guards had to restrain them for fear of sickness. The veterans of hardship looked at Carl's well-fed companions with disgust. "You are soft already," one spat. "Do you forget who you are? Do you forget what we swore?" Carl had no answer. He only thought of the chocolate bar he had hidden beneath his mattress. The moral erosion grew harder to ignore. In one corner of the camp, a group of die-hard loyalists tried to enforce the old discipline. They formed a clandestine network, the National Committee, punishing those they saw as collaborators or weaklings. Cigarettes hidden in secret caches were stolen in raids. Men who spoke admiringly of America woke with bruises on their faces. At night, the barracks echoed with whispered threats. But even this resistance withered under the weight of reality. For every loyalist there were 5 pragmatists, men who no longer saw shame in savoring chocolate, who admitted, if only in hushed tones, that life behind barbed wire in America was safer, easier, even kinder than life back home under bombs and rationing. One evening, Carl and Dieter sat outside near the fence, watching the guards smoke under a glowing lamp. The Americans laughed easily, trading stories of home. Carl exhaled slowly, his own smoke curling in the winter air. "They live as if war is a game," Dieter muttered. "No," Carl replied. His voice was quiet, weighted. "They live as if war cannot touch them." Dieter turned sharply. "And it hasn't. Not yet." The thought lingered long after they returned to the barracks. War had devoured Germany, reduced cities to rubble. starved its children. Yet across the ocean, its enemies lived fat, unscarred, tossing away luxuries like confetti. The realization spread through the camp, unspoken but undeniable. This was not merely defeat on the battlefield. This was defeat of the imagination. The crushing recognition that Germany's sacrifices could not match America's abundance. Every cigarette Karl lit, every square of chocolate he placed on his tongue, tasted like surrender. Still, he smoked. Still, he ate. And each time, the Reich inside him eroded a little more. Spring of 1945 brought with it a silence in the camp that was unlike any before. Not the silence of discipline, nor the silence of men exhausted after labor, but something heavier, a silence of realization. It began with rumors, as it always did. Whispers traded over cigarettes in the barracks. That Berlin was encircled. That Hitler had vanished from public view. That Goebbels' speeches had grown shrill with desperation. The men strained to piece truth from scraps. Newspapers filtered into the camp, their English headlines awkwardly translated by anyone with passable language skills. A guard, half mocking and half sympathetic, held up a copy of the New York Times one morning and tapped the headline, "Reich in final collapse." By then, the prisoners no longer doubted. Karl Müller sat on his bunk that evening, a Hershey bar untouched in his hands. He had saved it for weeks, an anchor against the endless sameness of days. But now, the foil wrapper gleamed like mockery. He thought of Anna, of little Lizzie, of the ruins where their apartment once stood. Did they have bread? Did they have even water? What would they think if they saw him now, fattened by American meatloaf, rich with tobacco, holding chocolate as if it were common? Around him, the barracks buzzed. Some men cheered the possibility of going home. Others spat in disgust, declaring that Germany would rise again. The die-hard loyalists still whispered oaths in corners, but their ranks thinned daily. The weight of reality was too great. And then the news came, not whispered but announced by the camp loudspeakers. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The moment fell like a hammer. For a long time, no one moved. No one spoke. The words hung in the air, raw and final. The Reich, which had once seemed as immovable as the mountains, was gone. The flags, the parades, the speeches, ashes now, the sacrifices of millions, the endless battles, the belief in destiny, reduced to a single word: surrendered. That night, the barracks erupted in arguments. Some cursed Hitler for betraying them. Some blamed the generals. Others, in bitterness, turned on each other. A fight broke out in the corner, fists flying, until guards rushed in and hauled the men away. Karl sat in silence, staring at the bar in his hand. He wanted to eat it, to bury it, to hurl it against the wall. Instead, he unwrapped it slowly, broke it into 4 pieces, and passed it to the men nearest him. None spoke. They chewed in silence, tasting both sweetness and defeat. The weeks that followed blurred. With Germany gone, the camp became a limbo. Prisoners were no longer soldiers of an enemy army, but men without a nation, men waiting to be sent back to a country that barely existed. The Americans treated them with the same strange generosity as before, perhaps even more so. Packages from the Red Cross appeared with added luxuries. Cigarettes were handed out by the carton. Guards, perhaps relieved that the war was over, joked with prisoners as though they were old acquaintances. But for many, this kindness cut deeper than cruelty. Karl worked one last farm detail before repatriation. The fields stretched under the sun, bursting with wheat, cattle fattened in barns. The farmers' children ran barefoot through the grass, laughing. When Karl finished his labor, the farmer's wife gave him a slice of pie and poured him coffee. She smiled, not mockingly, not warily, simply kindly, and Karl could barely meet her eyes. He felt like an imposter, a man who had crossed oceans in a uniform of conquest and now sat eating pie like a guest. That evening, back in camp, Karl and Dieter shared cigarettes by the fence. "It's over," Dieter said flatly. Karl nodded. Smoke curled between them. "Do you think we'll ever go home?" Dieter asked. Karl didn't answer at first. He stared at the glowing ember of his cigarette, at the darkness beyond the wire. Finally, he said, "Home won't be there. Not the way we remember." The words hung heavy. Both men knew they were true. The homes they would return to were ruins, the families hollowed by hunger and grief. And they themselves were changed, marked by the strange comfort of captivity. When repatriation finally began, the prisoners packed their meager belongings: a spare shirt, a few letters, maybe a photograph. Many carried cigarettes and chocolate hidden in bags or sewn into clothing, not for indulgence but as currency, survival for what awaited in the wreckage of Germany. The journey back across the Atlantic was quieter than the one that had brought them. No songs, no boasts, only men staring at the horizon, clutching small comforts in their hands. When Carl finally stepped onto German soil again, the reality struck harder than anything in America. Cities flattened, railways twisted, bridges collapsed into rivers, children begged on the streets, women sifted through rubble for scraps of wood. He reached Berlin after days of walking. His apartment was gone, a crater where it once stood. He found Anna in a crowded shelter, thinner than he remembered, her hair streaked with gray. Liese clung to her leg, eyes wide and hungry. Carl reached into his pack and pulled out a Hershey bar. He broke it in half, gave it to his daughter. She bit into it, her face lighting with a joy he had not seen in years. Tears stung his eyes as Anna watched silently, her lips trembling. In that moment, Carl understood the true weight of what he had carried across oceans. Not chocolate, not cigarettes, but the memory of a world where such things were abundant, casual, taken for granted. A world his nation had never stood a chance of defeating. The Reich had promised glory through blood and sacrifice. America had shown another kind of supremacy, one wrapped in foil, one lit at the end of a match. And in the years to come, long after the war was over, long after the uniforms were buried, that was the memory that endured among the men who had lived behind American barbed wire. The taste of cigarettes and chocolate, and the shattering knowledge that their enemies had possessed so much they could give luxuries even to their captives.